Good evening. I'm Tiziana Tedesco, and on behalf of the Italian Chamber of Commerce of Ontario and of Corrado Paina, our Executive Director, I would like to welcome you to our third Tutti a Tavola cooking class for the month of May. We're continuing with our weekly cooking classes hosted by Chef Roberto Fracchioni, professor at the School of Culinary Arts of Centennial College of Toronto, food consultant and brand ambassador for Prosciutto di Parma. Tonight, Chef Roberto will be demonstrating from his own kitchen how to prepare a tasty risotto with asparagus. This classic and simple dish is a favorite healthy way to enjoy traditional homemade Italian cuisine while supporting locally grown products and promoting sustainable agriculture. The ICCO is happy to continue collaborating with Fortino's supermarkets to present this series of 4 online cooking classes that occur every Tuesday nights at 6 p.m. Fortino's provides exceptional service to their customers during these difficult times and offers a safe environment for our grocery shopping through the dedication and commitment of their wonderful staff. If you don't have the ingredients you need for our recipes in your home, Fortino certainly has got you covered and will be able to assist while you're doing your grocery shopping. From tomorrow, you can get ready for the 4th cooking class next week, as Chef Roberto will show us how to prepare a juicy steak alla Fiorentina with grilled seasonable vegetables. During the program tonight, send us your questions through the chat at any time during the class as you prepare risotto with us. Chef Roberto will be happy to answer them. Also, feel free to get involved and interact with us. Send us your pictures of tonight's risotto. Contact us via Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. Before starting with the program, I would like to remind you that on Thursday, May 28th, from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m., the ICCO will present a Dinner for Italy, a fundraising online campaign organized by the Italian Embassy in Canada to support the Italian Red Cross COVID-19 preparedness and response activities. Follow our social media and visit our website for more details. And now, here are some images of Italy, which we hope you will be able to experience directly and safely soon again. Enjoy the class and let's get tutti a tavola, to the table. Buon appetito!
Welcome to my kitchen. Today, my name is Roberto and I'm going to be teaching you guys how to make a risotto. So a risotto is a very, very classic Italian dish. Very simple dish to prepare. But with most simple dishes, if you don't know a few important steps, it really sort of doesn't turn out as well. So I'm going to teach you guys all the little tricks that you need to make a risotto fantastic. This is one of my favorite things to do, honestly, in my years in a restaurant. This was absolutely one of my favorite things to teach cooks how to make. And the reason is a lot of people think they know how to make a risotto. But a lot of people also cut little corners, don't do a couple of the steps, a couple of the very important steps. So I'm going to show all of that to you. Very simple ingredients, starting with an onion. So just a regular onion. You don't have to, buy a fancy onion. You don't need vidalias. You don't need anything else. Just a regular onion that we're going to dice very, very, very finely. Now, this is one of the big steps. This is one of the important steps. There's not a lot of ingredients that go into a basic risotto, except for chicken stock, rice, and an onion. All the rices, all your risottos, doesn't matter what your finishing flavor is. Doesn't matter if you're doing it with beef or you're doing it with fish or you're with saffron. You always want to start with an onion. It just builds a little bit of flavor, a little bit of depth into the actual risotto. But we don't want pieces of risotto of onion in our risotto. We don't want to have chunks of onions because then you're biting down on them. They're going to be hard. They're very strong in flavor. So we want to dice them as absolutely fine, as thin as you possibly can. So if you have to, run your knife over top of it. After you dice it, if they still look a little bit big, just keep on chopping it. Just keep on doing this with your knife on top of it. It's not the best way to chop an onion, to dice an onion, but it's okay. We can do that. As long as they're nice and fine, as long as they're nice and tiny, it'll work out really well. Again, big chunks of onion, they take a break down when they're cooking, and we don't want that in our final product. So very finely diced onions. I'll show you how fine that is in a second. As fine as you can get it.
I'll take the opportunity to ask you a first question about the onion. Can you exchange the plain onion with sweet onion?
You can. You absolutely can. If you use a sweet onion, again, it's not a massive part of the dish. It's not like a big flavor. It's sort of in the background. So that's how fine they're diced. These are, I could have got a little bit tinier, but this will work well. If you use a sweet onion, yeah, I mean, you probably wouldn't even notice it if you switched between a sweet onion and a regular onion, but whatever it is. As long as it's an onion. You can get away with a shallot too. Some people will use shallots. I find shallots, they're a little bit more garlicky in flavor and they sort of overpower. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to start cooking these right away. So I have a lot to talk about in this demo, but I'm going to start cooking the onions right away because they do take a bit of time. So you're going to have to walk with me over to the stove. Sweating our onions. So this is a very important step, a very important part of making a risotto properly. When you make a risotto, it's always on low heat. You never have it, never even medium. I don't even go as high as medium. And it's a very slow process. It does take a little bit of time to make it, but commit yourself to it. Take the time that it needs. Don't try and rush it, or else it won't be a risotto. It'll just be boiled rice. So we take a pot. Any pot will do, as long as it's fairly large. Always select a pot that's larger than you think you need. And you'll see at the last step, just before we plate the risotto, why we want a larger sort of pot. So I'm just putting this up to a medium heat, and I'm going to put my onions in. And we're going to sweat the onion. So sweating is the exact opposite of sautéing. Sautéing is very high heat, and you're moving, you're sautéing, you're moving your vegetables around in the pan. You don't want to do this. all we want to do, low heat for a bit of time, a long time. We want to cook these without getting any brown in the onions. We don't want any brown color in the onions. We don't want to fry our onions. If you fry your onions, if they get too brown, then that flavor will penetrate, will permeate through your entire risotto, and your risotto will taste like fried onions. And if you want to eat fried onions, you know, go get a hot dog at that corner and you can eat some fried onions. But in a risotto, you just want the flavor of the onions to be released so they're nice and soft and the flavor is there, but there's no brown, no sauteing, no fried color at all. So very low, well, yeah, this is kind of medium heat, and this is going to take it'll probably take about 7-8 minutes of cooking our onions this way. So just make sure they're nice and flat, and be generous with the oil. You can see that there's quite a bit of oil in here. If you look in the bottom of the pan, I don't know if you can see that, I hope you can, but there's a bit of oil in there. Don't worry about that. We need some oil in the pan in order for the risotto to cook properly. So while our onions are cooking, we're going to go back over to here. Sorry, you guys are going to be walking back and forth a lot with me in the kitchen. Back over here in the cutting board. Now, while we're cooking off our onions, we're just going to start prepping our asparagus. So this is a very, very, very simple risotto. Asparagus, I'm using some chicken stock, but you can use vegetable stock if you want. You can use beef stock, you can use water, you can use whatever you want. I'm going to do a very simple cut with this asparagus. This is the first of the Ontario asparagus, so very exciting. This time of year, I get excited because you start to see some green vegetables coming into the grocery stores, and it's been a long winter. I'm sick of eating celery root and beets and squash, so asparagus always gets me excited for the vegetables that are coming. So I have to go stir my onions very quickly. So our asparagus, when they come in from Ontario and they're nice and fresh, you really don't have to do much to them at all. You want to trim off the ends, and a lot of recipes will say, you know, just bend it and it snaps wherever it gets too tough. I find that doesn't work very well because if you hold it like this, it's going to snap there. Here, it's going to snap in between your fingers. So what I do is I just sort of feel with my thumbnail. You just give it a little poke, and you can feel where your thumbnail pierces the skin of the asparagus very easily. That's where you want to start using it. If the skin is very, very thick, sometimes you'll see it'll be kind of purple, like this one. If you see that purple color, that means for sure that it's going to be too thick, and you won't be able to have it break down when it cooks. So it'll be really, really not so nice. So you can always just peel it. With a vegetable peeler, you just go around and peel the base of your asparagus. This usually happens later on in the season. As the season goes on, the stalks tend to be a lot tougher. Or if it's coming from countries far, far, far away, you can give it a quick little peel like that. Again, this is very fresh Ontario asparagus, so we don't have to peel them. I'm just going to take them all, and I'm just going to, actually that's a lot, I won't do it all. And I'm just going to cut them on a little bias, just because I like the ends of the asparagus to be on an angle. Chefs have all this weird stuff, you know, every chef has their thing, but I don't like, I'll show you what I mean. I don't like asparagus when it's cut like that. To me, I don't know what it is. Something about it just looks a little bit pedestrian. So what we do is I just like to cut it on an angle. I like to cut it like that. So you have a nice big long point to it. Does it make a difference? No. It helps because the stalk is a lot thicker than the tip of it. So when you cut it on an angle, it sort of takes out the really heavy, the weight of the base of the asparagus. So it, you know, it cooks that woody part of the asparagus a little bit better, I find anyway. So my cooks have always, you know, laughed at me or grumbled about me behind my back because whenever we have asparagus on the menu, I always make sure that they cut it on a bias, and yeah, they get kind of I don't know. I won't. I have to stay PG, so I can't say what they say about me. But anyway, asparagus is something that I take serious. So we're going to cut all of our asparagus that way, and then we're going to go back over to the stove, and we're just going to cook these. Now, this is an important part of the process. It's very hard when you're cooking a risotto to cook your products. Again, whether it's asparagus or whether it's sweet peppers, whether it's doesn't matter if it's fish or if it's meat or if it's anything else. If you try and cook it in the rice, it's really hard to control it so that the rice is cooked and the vegetables are cooked at the same time. So you can see that my onions are cooking very, very gently. This is actually even a bit high. You can see that the oil is sort of popping. You don't need it that high. So I'm down to like number 2 on my stove. And you just want to push them around, saute them until they're nice and soft. A piece, one of these little pieces of onions, you should be able to squish it between your finger and your thumb and just have it sort of disintegrate. That's what you want. If you have to squeeze really hard and they kind of slide and pop out of your finger, it means that they still need a little bit longer to cook. So just let them cook. Be patient. A risotto, I always say, a risotto is like a newborn baby. You don't have to sit here and stare at it and be like, oh, what's going on? You don't have to watch every second of it, but you can't walk away from it either. You have to pay attention to it. So if you start a risotto, give yourself half an hour. Make sure that you won't be distracted for half an hour. Put the dog out in the backyard, make sure the kids are, do whatever you have to do to make sure that you won't be distracted. The other important thing when you're making a risotto or when you're cooking in general, I always find it funny how people say, I have to make dinner. I have to make dinner. I don't know. Having to make dinner, that's sort of the wrong, in my mind anyway, we get to make dinner. It's not a chore. And if you find it to be a chore, if you find it work, then, you know what, change some things about it. Put on some good music. Open a glass of wine. Have your family join you. My 5-year-old son is always in the kitchen cooking with me. And he loves cooking with me. And it's like, daddy-son time, and it's a lot of fun. We approach food, we approach cooking, I find quite often with this mentality that it's hard and this mentality that it's difficult. And it really shouldn't be. So you have half an hour. If you just chase your family out of the kitchen and you tell them, hey, I'm making a risotto, it gives you half an hour to yourself to drink some wine or coffee, whatever it is you like, bourbon, if whatever floats your boat. Put on some music and enjoy your time in the kitchen. You'll find that your food will just naturally become a lot better. Your food is always cooking with a positive attitude. Sorry, that's my rant about cooking.
Chef,
I'll stop now and I'll talk about food. So,
Chef, if I may interrupt you, there's a couple of questions in regards to the asparagus. Did you add anything to the asparagus when you cooked it, and what temperature are you cooking it at? And also, can you substitute the asparagus with any other vegetables like mushrooms, or can you give us some more options?
Absolutely. So when it comes to making a risotto, you can use anything you want in it. You could use, if you want to do vegetables, you can use any vegetable you want. The rule of thumb is that you pair the liquid that you're using in the risotto to the ingredient. So if you're going to do a mushroom risotto, for example, then instead of like, this is just a chicken stock, I would use a mushroom stock. So I would take some dried mushrooms, soak them in some water, and then use that liquid to make the risotto. If you're doing a fish risotto, I use fish stock. To cook the asparagus, all I did, a little bit of olive oil, so a little drizzle, I probably put, I don't know, a good tablespoon in there, and a little salt and pepper, and that's it. Temperature is very low again. I'm at like 2.5, because I don't want any color on the asparagus. I want them to be nice and bright green and vibrant on the risotto when it's done. So that's it. You can grill the asparagus as well, If it wasn't so nasty outside, I could have ran outside and grilled them on the barbecue or used a grill pan. But I'm just doing it very clean and simple. First of all, yes, white asparagus is a wonderful ingredient. You absolutely could use white asparagus. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to cut all the asparagus now into smaller pieces. I like cooking them whole because it's a lot easier. I find to have more control over the cooking of the asparagus when they're in large pieces as opposed to when they're in small pieces. So our asparagus is here. It's cooked, it's nice and soft, and I'm just going to take it out of the pan so that it can sort of cool down. Now, while that's cooling down, this is going to be one of the last steps is we're actually going to put the asparagus into the risotto. So I'm just going to let these cool down on my cutting board, and then I'm going to cut them into small pieces. So we've talked about the onions, we've talked about asparagus so far. Now we have to talk about rice. So rice is the hard one. I could spend 4 hours just talking about the rice. When you buy the rice, you'll see bags that say rice for risotto. That's, I don't know, it's like going to a car dealership and saying, hey, I want to buy a car for driving. Of course, it's fine. But you want to get specific rice for making a risotto. So in Canada, we're limited to about 3 different kinds of rice. So there's arborio, canaroli, and violone nano. Those are the 3 that you will see most often in the grocery stores here in Canada. Arborio is probably the most popular. You'll see this absolutely everywhere. It's a very good rice. It works really well. The challenge with arborio rice is you have to be on. Your timing has to be perfect. From the time it's cooked, if it doesn't go into a plate or onto a plate and into your mouth in, you have about 3-4 minutes, it will overcook. And then what happens when it overcooks is it gets really mushy and it's more like mashed potatoes than it is rice. Whenever you make a risotto, it's kind of like a pasta. It should be al dente. We'll talk about how to get there when we actually start cooking it. So arborio works well. They're beautiful grains. They're all short grain rice. Arborio tends to be a little bit fatter than the canaroli, but it still works really well. Canaroli is sort of seen as a superior rice to the arborio. And the reason is, there's a couple of reasons. One, it is very hard to overcook canaroli rice. Unlike the arborio, if you're cooking the canaroli and it sits in the pot for a few extra minutes, it's okay. It won't overcook. It's a little bit skinnier. The grain is a little bit skinnier. That's not a huge deal. But it just holds its doneness for a lot longer. As professional chefs, we usually go for the canaroli because it just gives us a little bit more time to get it on the plate, to put our garnish on, to call for our server, to scream for our server to come and pick up the food and bring it out to the table. So it just gives us a little bit of extra time. Now, our onions are nice and soft. So you'll notice I'm going to put in a bunch more oil. This is why you don't have to be worried in the beginning. We put a lot of oil in. The reason is we want to coat each grain of rice with a little bit of oil. So I'm going to do about that much rice. I'll put a bit more in. I think my son's hungry. So I'm using the canaroli, and it doesn't matter which rice you use. This is a very important step. So once our rice goes in, we want to let it cook for a second in the oil. This is why we need so much oil. You can see the bottom of the pan is dry. There's no oil sitting in the bottom of the pan. You want to coat each piece of rice, each grain of rice, with a little bit of oil. What makes all these rices, the canaroli, the violone nano, and the arborio, what makes them work well for a risotto is the level of starch that they have in the actual grains.
It's a specific starch. It's from amylopectin is the name of the starch that's in the actual rice. You want to know, but that starch, we want to keep it in the rice as long as we can. So if we coat it with a little bit of oil, that sort of prevents the starch from starting to leach out of the grains of rice. So you want to cook it just for a minute. And my aunt, who's like the single most talented cook I've ever worked with in my life, told me that you cook it until the rice has eyes. And it's really hard. I don't know if I can show you, but you cook it until each grain of rice has a little white spot in the middle, but the outside of the rice is a little bit dark. That is the oil penetrating into each grain of rice. So,
Chef, I have a couple of questions for you. Could you just let us know how much rice you use? Like, what's the measurement per person? And is the rice put on medium heat?
Always on low. So I'm on number, like, I'm at 2.5 still here. Very, very low. You don't ever want it to boil. You don't ever want it to get too hot. Portioning, I use about 2 ounces dry weight of rice per person if it's an appetizer. So if you have 4 people, you do 8 ounces. That's what I did here. This is a little bit more because, I don't know, I like risotto. So does my wife and my son. So we're going to eat some good risotto tonight. If you're going to do it as an entree, you can bulk it up. You can do up to 4 ounces.
There was also an interesting question if in Italy risotto is usually eaten as an entree or a side dish, as well as another interesting question: do you wash the rice before you cook it?
No. Okay, so washing of the rice, you never do that. When you wash your rice, you would remove the starch. That's what you do when you want to make dry, fluffy rice. But with the risotto, we want to keep all that starch in there. So
you were just telling us some more about the measurements about the rice that you were using and the heat of the pot.
Okay, so nice and low. So now I've turned the heat down to like 2, very, very low, and we start adding our liquid. Once we start adding our liquid, this is where we really have to pay attention. So we want to make sure that no pieces of rice are left kind of up on the side of the pot like this. If it's too far up on the side of the pot and it misses a little bit of the liquid that goes into it, then it won't cook properly. So we have to make sure that your sides of your pots are clean, but you don't want to get in here and keep on stirring it. Try not to stir it too much. We let our liquid evaporate and absorb into the rice until you can do that. See how when I drag the bottom of my spatula across the bottom of the pot, you can see the bottom of the pot. Once the rice is that dry, that's when you add more liquid. So I'm doing about 8 ounces at a time of liquid. And once the liquid goes in, you just give the pot a little shake so that all the rice sort of falls down and is covered by the liquid. And make sure that there's none hanging out on the sides of the pot. That's it. That's all you have to do. And you let it simmer. Very, very low simmer. So you can see the bubbles that are happening there. You don't want a heavy boil. You want a very, very light simmer. This is why it takes a little bit of time. Your stock can be, again, any flavor that you want, but it's preferable if the stock is warm. So this is, again, just a little bit of chicken stock, and I just have it warm. It doesn't have to be boiling, but if it's warm, your rice will cook a lot quicker, and it won't break down as much. It won't become as soft during the cooking process. We want to leave that right to the end. So this chicken stock, 8 ounces at a time, and you kind of let it go.
Chef, I just want to interrupt you for 1 second. When you cut out, did you happen to add the wine to the rice already?
Yeah, oh, sorry. So I spoke about that. So the wine, if you're going to add wine, you put it in before the stock goes in. So that was the first flood. You put, once your rice is nice and dry, you put your wine in first, let that cook off, and then your stock starts to go into it. Or your water, if you just want to do plain water, you can do that as well. Sorry, there were 2 other questions before, and I already forgot them.
There was another question in regards to washing the rice, and if in Italy you eat risotto as an entree or as a side dish.
Oh, yeah. So you didn't hear the rant about washing your rice?
I think it was
Okay.
cutting out when you were talking about it.
Don't wash your rice, please. It's the worst thing you can do for a risotto. The whole reason a risotto is good is because it's creamy, and that creaminess comes from the starch. If you wash your rice, you wash off all that starch, and then you won't get a risotto. You'll get like jasmine rice pilaf. So do not wash your rice, ever, ever, ever. I remember as a child sitting in front of a big tray of rice, and my mom would make me go through and pick out one by one all the little pieces of grains of rice that were a little bit brown. You don't have to worry about that now. The grading systems are way better, so you don't get little brown pieces of rice in there. But that's the only prep that's ever done to rice. Don't ever wash it. In Italy, is it eaten as an appetizer or as an entree? I've always had it as an appetizer. I don't know if I've ever seen it as an entree. But here in Canada, yeah, you'll see it as both ways. Even here tonight, this is my dinner tonight. I'm not going to make an appetizer. I'm not making an entree. I'm just going to have a nice big bowl of risotto. So now we're going to cut our asparagus. So this is where we cut it into small pieces. You want to have pieces that are small enough that they can fit on the fork and that you can get them into your mouth without too much trouble, without too much, finagling and trying to wrestle it into your mouth. You want to do it so that they're pretty. You can see that it's asparagus, but it's not so big that you need to use a knife and fork. So I'm not on camera now because I'm back over at the stove, and I'm just putting another ladle of stock into my risotto. Don't do this until you feel really comfortable making a risotto. You better to stand over by the stove and just watch your risotto.
Chef, could you explain to us why you cut the asparagus after you cook it? And also there was a question about the chicken stock. Where can you find good chicken stock?
Okay, so I cut the asparagus afterwards because I like the way it looks. There's two reasons. One, when you cut the asparagus afterwards, you get really clean cuts. And by clean, I mean, nice and straight, and see if I can show you. Like, it's nice and it's just a sharp, clean angle. Whereas if you cut them first and cook them, those little angles sort of break apart. All the little edges of the asparagus kind of break apart, and it gets a little bit muddy. You can do it either way. Really, there's no right or wrong way. I just like doing it whole and then cutting afterwards. The other reason is that it's easier to cook when they're whole, especially if you're going to do it on the barbecue. If they're whole, they're just a lot easier to handle. They're a lot easier to manipulate. And in the pan, you saw how easy it was. You just put them in the pan and give them a little saute, a little hi, how you doing, to get them cooked. So
could you also
now
I'm sorry, Chef, to interrupt you, just repeat what kind of wine you used and how much?
So for the wine, I don't know. You just want a dry wine. You don't want anything too sweet. So a Sangiovese works really well as long as it's a nice dry Sangiovese. You can be happy with that. As far as volume goes, I put about a ½ ounce per portion of rice. So 2 ounces of dry rice and about a ½ ounce volume, like liquid portion of wine per portion. So our asparagus is all cut up, and we're just going to leave it off to the side. That's all we really have to do. So I sort of started to talk about the different types of rice, and I never really finished. The third rice, we talked about cannaroli, we talked about arborio. The third type of rice, violone nano, is the one that is preferred if you go to Veneto. It's a rice from the region, so they use it in all of their risottos as opposed to the cannaroli. Works very well. The nice thing about the violone nano, if you use it, is it takes a lot more liquid. It can absorb twice its weight in liquid. So if you start with 2 ounces of dried rice, you can have up to 4 ounces of liquid in the rice before it's actually cooked. So a lot of chefs prefer it because you can really get a lot more flavor into the rice. But play with them. When you're starting out, if you're going to do the rice for your first time, I recommend using the cannelloni. Just again, because it's a little more forgiving. It's a little bit easier to work with. You don't have to get it out onto the table quite so quick. So our rice is cooking, our asparagus is cut. The only other 2 ingredients that we have to worry about is the butter and some Parmigiano Reggiano. So butter and Parmigiano Reggiano go in right at the end of the process. So this is sort of the money shot. This is like the big important part of making the risotto, is finishing the risotto. We'll get to that fairly soon. This should be done fairly soon. Now, to tell the doneness of risotto, there's only one way, and that is with a spoon. There's no other way to tell when it's done. You can't look at it and say, yeah, that rice is done. You can't use a temperature probe. There's no way to know except tasting it. So while you're cooking, you're going to be tasting quite a bit. I'm going to put a little more salt in there. So I'm just sprinkling a little bit of kosher salt in. You want to start adding your salt fairly early in the cooking process. The earlier you add your salt, the more time it'll have to actually season all the grains of rice, not just sort of salt on top of the risotto, but actually penetrate into the grains. As you taste, it's just like when you cook pasta. There'll be a point where it's firm, it has a little bit of a chew to it, but it's not chalky. So right now it's still a bit chalky. And when I say chalky, it means that when you bite into it, it's like biting into a piece of chalk. It's firm and it's kind of dry. As soon as that chalkiness goes away, you have about 2 minutes, 3 minutes before it's done. So you just keep on tasting it. When it comes to adding the liquid, I've seen people and I've seen recipes before where they just take all their liquid and they pour it in and they put the lid on and they let it cook. That's not the right way to make a risotto. It kind of works, but it's not the right way. It just doesn't turn out as well. So the right way to do it is, again, small amounts of liquid being added regularly to the pot. The trick is knowing when to add the liquid. So right now you can see it's a little bit dry. When I drag my spatula across the bottom of the pot, see how it all sort of runs back together? That means that there's enough liquid in there to actually cook the rice. You want to let it cook until when you drag your spatula across the bottom of the pot, the rice doesn't run back together. It stays separate. It happens fairly quick. So see how it's sort of starting to go back together? In another, I don't know, 20, 30 seconds, it'll be ready to add more liquid. If you want...
Chef, I have a couple of questions for you.
Sure.
One, can you use jasmine rice as well? And also, is the stock that you used heated? And where can you find good chicken stock?
Oh, yeah.
And do you usually use all of your chicken stock, or can you give us some background on that as well? And then we also had a question, if you can just repeat if you should cook the asparagus with the rice, or it's better not to cook it with the rice like you're doing right now.
Okay, always cook your ingredients separately. That way you can control. So that I know my asparagus is cooked perfectly. Now I can focus on the rice. So see now how it's not going back together when I pull that? That's when you know to add more stock. Where to buy good chicken stock? Well, I mean, I've always made my own chicken stock. I like making chicken stock. But if not, most of the grocery stores, I know Fortino's has some wonderful chicken stock products. You always want to make sure that you get the low sodium variety though. A lot of the chicken stocks rely on salt as a preservative. So you want to look for low sodium chicken stocks. And there are times where, you know, I'll run out of it. I'll run out of my homemade chicken stock and I'll just run to Fortino's and grab some from Fortino's. You cannot use jasmine rice. You can try and you'll make a rice dish, but you will not make a risotto. The whole point of a risotto is that it's rich and it's creamy. And that only comes from the starch that's in the rice and it's the starch from the short grain Canaroli, Vialone Nano, or arboreal rice. Arboreal rice is very, very similar to like Japanese sushi rice. And you can't make, you know, sticky little pieces of sushi with rice that doesn't have the starch. Same thing with a risotto. You need the starch content. So yeah, jasmine, basmati, any of the long grain rices, they don't work. They just don't work. They don't have the starch content. Did I miss any questions there?
No, just in regards to the broth, how much broth are you using, and is it heated? As well as what's the temperature of your stove right now for the rice?
Okay, so my rice is at about number 2. You just want to keep adjusting the heat until you see this very slight little simmer of liquid. That's all you want to see. You don't want a big heavy boil. So whatever it takes on your stove to be a light simmer, that's all you need. The stock is absolutely warm. If you use cold stock, the temperature of the rice fluctuates too much. It's boiling, it's hot, and then you put cold stock in and the temperature drops. And then it comes up again when it boils, and then it drops. So it slows down the cooking process, and it actually breaks off a lot of the grains of rice. So it just doesn't work well. I shouldn't say it doesn't work well. It's just a lot harder to do it well with cold stock. So just take a few minutes to warm up your stock. It doesn't have to be boiling. It just needs to be warm. Okay, so I'm tasting my rice, and the chalkiness is gone. So I'm going to adjust my seasoning one more time. I'm going to put a little bit more salt in here. Give it a little stir.
I take the opportunity, Chef, to ask you a couple of questions that we received earlier in regards to the asparagus. Can you mix asparagus and mushrooms, for example, or can you also use some meat in the risotto?
Absolutely. You can. A risotto is like a blank canvas. You can put whatever you want into it. So quite often I'll make like a full-on vegetable risotto. So I'll get some fennel, I'll get sweet peppers, I'll get asparagus and fiddleheads. Basically stroll through the aisles at the Fortino's and see what looks good and put it into the vegetables, or put it into the risotto. My mom always used to make a risotto with saffron and pieces of sausage. So she would just take, like, you know, the sausage we made at home and open it up and fry that off first, take it out of the pan, and then cook the onions in the fat, and then add it all in at the end. So yeah, you can use pieces of sausage. I've made it with quail before. I've done it with duck. I've done it with a million different pieces of meat. And a seafood risotto is fantastic as well. So if you start with a fish stock, you can add any fish, anything that you want for fish, and make a seafood risotto. The big difference if you're doing a seafood risotto is the cheese at the end. You use a lot less cheese, and generally I won't use Parmigiano Reggiano. I'll go for a milder cheese, like a Piave or a Montasio, something that has a little bit less bite to it.
I also have a couple of follow-up questions. A few people have actually asked about saffron in the risotto. When would you add it?
So when you do a saffron risotto, your saffron goes into the stock. So I just made it, I don't know, last week or the week before. It's very simple. You take water, put it in a pot, and throw your saffron into the water so that the flavor comes out of the saffron and flavors the liquid that you're going to cook the risotto in. If you try and add it right into the pot here, what happens is that it doesn't, the flavor of each little thread of saffron doesn't come out and penetrate into the entire dish. So you'll get a little bit of rice that tastes a little bit like saffron, and then you'll eat one thread of saffron and it'll be like, wow, that's a saffron risotto. So if you put it into your water and let it steep in your water just for like 15-20 minutes, it'll be warm enough that you can make your risotto. It'll be flavorful enough that it'll get the flavor all the way through your entire dish.
Someone is also asking how you would make a totally green risotto. I'm assuming they mean the color.
Yes. So if you want to do a green risotto, you take, I usually use spinach, and you just blanch your spinach. That means like just plunge it into some boiling water, take it out of the boiling water, and then puree it in a blender, and then you add that right at the end. So right now I would be adding my spinach puree. If you try, you only want to put it in right at the end, because if you start using it in the beginning, the green goes away and you end up with like a, I don't know, like a very boring, bland, browny kind of green risotto, which nobody wants to eat.
And could you also use radicchio in the risotto? And can you also tell us just a few details of what kind of fish you could use for risotto? Can you use shrimp or what kind of other fish?
So generally when I make a seafood risotto, I will put some, usually whitefish. I usually stay away from like salmon and things like that, because it's just a little bit, I don't know. It just kind of like makes it look muddy. But generally, yeah, I'll do shrimp, I'll do cod, I'll do, I don't know, what else do I, oh, scallops. I'll always like sear a scallop and sort of garnish it with a little piece of scallop, for sure. But yeah, anything that's white and like whitefish, pickerel, anything like that works really, really well. Okay.
We also have a question that already came in at the beginning. I was waiting to ask you, if you had to double the recipe, does that prolong the cooking time, or do you just keep adding the stock until it's ready?
Yeah, you just keep adding the stock. Cooking time, it's really funny. Even if you're doing 2 portions or you're doing 20 portions, it really doesn't affect the cooking time too much. As long as your pot is, you know, exponentially larger, it'll still cook the same amount of in the same amount of time. So now our rice is done. It's fairly dry. So my pot's kind of hot, but I'll show you. If you look at it, it's fairly dry looking. That's okay, because this is where the beautiful part of risotto happens. This is called the mantecare, and this is where you turn the rice into a risotto. So you have butter and you have some Parmigiano Reggiano. Someone's gonna ask, can I use Padano? Yeah, you can use Padano. The flavor is different, but you absolutely can use Padano. Most restaurants will use Padano because it's, you know, a little bit less expensive. But what we want to do now is we add our asparagus. So our asparagus is just hanging out at room temperature. Don't worry, the rice, there's enough heat in the rice to warm it through, to warm up those little pieces of asparagus. So we just give it a quick stir. Now, this is the part that is really sort of the hardest. And that is because you really need to watch your timing. So I've been talking too much. So my rice dried out just from the time that I showed you to now. It's getting a little dry. So I'm just going to add a little bit more liquid to it. Give it a little stir. And our asparagus now is warmed through. Now we do the magic part. We add our butter and our Parmigiano. The rule of thumb, first of all, dice your butter. I always dice my butter into little pieces. It just dissolves and melts better into the rice. The rule of thumb.
How much would you use of the butter?
What's that?
How much butter? So
yeah, this is the thing. See how much you think you need and use twice as much. This is a ½ pound of butter, and I'm probably going to use most of it. The reason is this is what makes it creamy. This is what makes it rich. This is what gives it its flavor. Some chefs, and I had to work for a chef who used to make me put cream, like 35% cream, into the risotto to make it creamy. That's not a risotto. A risotto, the creaminess comes from the starch of the rice, and it comes from the butter and from the Parmigiano.
So
now,
is the butter salted or unsalted?
Unsalted, unsalted, unsalted.
And could it be substituted with olive oil as well, or is butter always the best?
If you use olive oil, you don't get the creaminess. And I have had to do that before. I have had to make vegan risotto before, and it's okay, but it doesn't. It just doesn't melt, and it doesn't make the same kind of creaminess. So while we're doing this, this is the important part, because you can see now I'm actually working the risotto. I'm actually kind of not whisking it, but I'm beating it. I'm being very, you know, angry with the risotto. This is because we want the starch and the outside grains of the risotto to start breaking down. We want that starch to sort of dissolve into the risotto. So that's our cheese and our butter into our risotto. And you can see it's very, very, very different now. It's actually liquid. It's actually kind of runny. This is where you really find out if you made your risotto properly. If I had arborio rice, so this is again why I chose cannaroli, because if I had arborio rice, it would already be overcooked. It would have already been overcooked in the time it's taken me to explain and and plate this. So this is how we tell if we made it well. It's how it goes onto the plate. So a risotto should never go onto the plate and run and be flat. It shouldn't be so liquid that it runs and turns into like a puddle of rice. It should not be firm enough that if you put it onto a plate, you could like mold it into, you know, a sculpture. That means it's too liquid. What a risotto should do is when you put it into your plate, it should move for about 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3, a little bit loose. So it should, you put it on and it should sag. 1, 2, 3, and then stop. If it doesn't stop and it keeps on running, it means it's too loose. If you put it on and it stays in the exact same shape that you put it into the bowl at, it means it's too dry. It takes a little bit of playing. It takes a little bit of experimentation, but once you get good at it, it's a very easy dish. This is one of the things that I do when people come over for dinner all the time, because it's super easy. If you use cannaroli, you have a little bit of time to play with it, to do your garnishes like I'm doing now. I reserved a little piece of the asparagus from before, just the little tips, because I want to put that on as garnish so that you can see what's inside the rest of the risotto. Now, if you
Chef, I have a few questions for you.
Sure.
If you can just briefly answer, if you can give us an option for somebody that is allergic to dairy, just briefly, what's the difference between Padano and
Parmigiano?
Parmigiano, thank you.
Yeah.
As well as how would you fix a runny risotto, and what kind of cheese do you use on a saffron risotto?
Saffron risotto, use Parmigiano Reggiano. The difference between Padano and Parmigiano, that's a 4-hour class. They're similar, but it's moisture content and it's flavor. To boil it down and make it very simple, Parmigiano Reggiano has a drier consistency and sort of a nuttier, sweeter flavor, whereas Padano is a lot higher moisture and a lot milder in flavor. To do it dairy-free, it's hard because the cheese really kind of makes the dish. So you can use, like I said, I've had to do it, and I'll use oil instead of butter during the whole process. And then right at the end, I'll use like a dairy-free cheese. If it's a lactose problem, in Parmigiano Reggiano, there is 0.01% lactose. All cheeses after they're aged for about 6 months have next to no lactose. 98% of the lactose in cheeses are in the whey, are in the liquid that is drained off before you start making the cheese. So when you start making cheese, you only have 2% of the lactose that's in the milk, in the raw product, and that gets converted during the aging process. So if there was a lactose problem, depending how severe it is, I still use Parmigiano. If it's very severe, then I don't. And was there another question in there that I forgot?
How would you fix a runny risotto?
Oh yeah, cook it a little longer. So if it's too runny, you just let it boil a little bit longer, or you just let it sit in the pot. As it sits in the pot, it'll continue to dry up and it'll continue to get more solid. So our risotto, when it's done, I'm just gonna try that. Oh yeah, that's awesome. Our risotto looks like this. So I just put a couple pieces of Parmigiano Reggiano that I just cut with a peeler in here. I put a couple slivers of just a spicy pepper because I like having a little bit of heat in my risotto. So this is the one I'm going to eat. My son loves gorgonzola, so I'm going to put a little dollop of gorgonzola into this one for him. And you can use whatever kind of garnish you want on here. You can put a drizzle of olive oil on here. I can't tilt the plate too much or else it's just going to slide right out. But you can garnish with whatever you want. The important things when you're making a risotto is be patient and be focused. Enjoy your time in the kitchen. Make it as comfortable as you want, as you possibly can, so that when you're in there, you can really focus on your timing. The more you do it, the better you get at it. You can just look at it and say, yeah, it needs some more water, or it needs some more stock. You can look at it and say, yeah, I think it's pretty much done. You'll get better at it. But make sure your onions are nice and small. You can see if I look through my risotto, I don't see any chunks of onion. Make sure that your stock is warm. Make sure the quality of your ingredients is good. Don't use a piece of Parmigiano if it has mold on it or if it's too dried out. Make sure that your stock tastes good, and make sure that when it's done, you can get it on a plate and serve it right away, or you can just take the whole pot out and drop this down on the table and everybody's ready to eat. If you have to call your whole family to come or all your guests to come and it takes them 15 minutes to, you know, wash their hands and come up to the dining room table, then the rice is going to overcook. So make sure that they're ready when your rice is done. Like I said, quality ingredients, take your time with it, relax, take a deep breath, enjoy your time making the risotto, and it'll turn out wonderful every time, I guarantee it.
Chef, I have just a few more questions for you.
Sure.
Before we end this class. At the end, could you please show the rice packs again that you have there in front of you, just to show people? The other question was the radicchio, when would you put it in the rice, also at the end? And what kind of wine or beverage would you pair with the risotto?
So a risotto, I mean, it all depends on what the flavor is for wine. So with this, with asparagus, it would be like, yeah, dry Sangiovese. But if you're doing a meat risotto, you could get away with, you know, some heavier reds, some medium-bodied reds. You just have to make sure to be careful because it's very cheesy, very rich. So you need a wine that has a little bit of acidity. So like a younger Chianti would be awesome because it is sort of fruity, but it has a nice acidity to cut through the fattiness of the rice. The other question, the radicchio, yes, if you're going to add anything green or anything that's very delicate, like a julienne of radicchio, then you put it in right at the end. After the cheese goes in, you just put it in and you give it a little stir, and the heat of the rice will cook that ingredient. Same with the basil. I just put a little sprig on top. But if I wanted to put actual flavoring of basil in here, I would put it in, yeah, right at the very end, like right before I put it onto the plate. Any other questions? Before I forget, I know I haven't had time today because this was a tough one. I want to thank Fortino's again. I was up there this morning to go buy the ingredients today, and I can't believe, I just can't believe how wonderful an experience it is. From someone who's been, you know, very nervous and very tentative to get out there, going and shopping at the Fortino's was just a wonderful experience. So I really hope someone from Fortino's is watching so I could say thank you very much. As a customer, you've made the shopping experience very comfortable and very safe and wonderful. So thank you very much for all of that. Any other questions?
So I think if there are no any other questions, we just want to say thank you so much to Chef Roberto Fracchioni for this class. We hope you have enjoyed learning how to prepare tonight's risotto with asparagus. Sorry for the technical difficulties, but we hope you still had the chance, and I'm sure you had to experience all the stages of the preparation. Chef Roberto, Astrid D'Urso, and all the staff at the Italian Chamber of Commerce of Ontario, including myself, would like to thank you for joining us for this class and remind you to tune in again next week at the same time to learn the secrets for a mouth-watering bistecca alla Fiorentina. Once again, a heartfelt thank you to Fortinos and the Fortino teams for sponsoring this class. Arrivederci and buon appetito.